Hey there, plant lovers. Welcome back to Botanic Haven, your go-to channel for all things gardening, plant care, and creating those beautiful green spaces, both indoors and out. Today, we're diving into something that might sound a bit paradoxical at first, but trust me, once you understand it, it'll completely change how you approach certain plants in your garden. We're talking about plants that actually grow better when you don't plant them in the traditional sense. Now, I know that sounds strange, but stick with me here because this is one of those gardening secrets that can save you time, effort, and honestly, a lot of frustration. So, what do I mean when I say a plant grows better when you don't plant it? Well, I'm talking about those amazing species that thrive when they're allowed to self-seed, spread naturally, or grow in conditions that we might normally consider less than ideal. These are the rebels of the plant world, the ones that look at our carefully prepared garden beds and say, "Thanks, but I'll do my own thing." And you know what? They're often right. Some of the most stunning displays I've ever seen in gardens have come from plants that were basically left to their own devices. They pop up in gravel paths, between paving stones, in the cracks of walls, and in spots where you'd swear nothing could possibly grow. Let me tell you about my friend Daisy. She's been gardening for about 15 years, and she used to be one of those meticulous gardeners who planned everything down to the last detail. One year she planted California poppies in a dedicated bed with beautiful, rich soil. She watered them regularly, fussed over them, made sure they had everything they needed. And you know what happened? They were okay, just okay. A bit leggy, not many flowers, and they seemed to struggle despite all her attention. But then something interesting happened. The next spring, those poppies came back, but not in her carefully prepared bed. They showed up in the gravel driveway, in the cracks between stones in her path, even in a patch of pretty poor soil near her fence. And they were absolutely spectacular. Masses of vibrant orange and yellow blooms, sturdy stems, and they just kept flowering all season long. California poppies are actually a perfect example of this phenomenon. In their native habitat, they grow in areas with poor, rocky soil and minimal water. When you plant them in rich, amended soil and give them regular watering, you're actually creating conditions that are too good for them. It sounds crazy, right? But these plants have evolved to thrive in challenging conditions. Rich soil makes them produce lots of foliage but fewer flowers. Too much water can actually cause root problems. But scatter their seeds on gravel or poor soil, leave them alone, and they'll give you a show that'll make your neighbours stop and stare. If this guide has helped you, write 1 in the comments. And if not, write 0. This way, I'll know which tips are most useful for your garden. Now let's talk about another group of plants that fall into this category, the ones that prefer to grow in cracks and crevices. I'm thinking particularly of things like creeping thyme, erigeron, and various sedums. My neighbour Oliver has this gorgeous stone path leading to his front door, and between almost every stone there's creeping thyme growing. It forms these perfect little cushions of green that release the most amazing scent when you step on them. The thing is, he never planted it there. He'd tried to establish thyme in his herb garden several times, always with mixed results. But a few seeds somehow made their way into those path cracks, and suddenly he had more thyme than he knew what to do with. The secret here is drainage and growing conditions. Many of these crevice-dwelling plants come from alpine or Mediterranean environments where they naturally grow in rocky areas with sharp drainage. When we plant them in garden soil, even if we add grit and sand to improve drainage, it's often still too moisture retentive for them. But a crack between paving stones? That's perfect. Water drains away immediately, the stones provide warmth, and the restricted root space actually encourages the plant to stay compact and bloom more heavily. It's counterintuitive, but these plants are essentially happier being squeezed into tight spots than they are with all the root room in the world. Foxgloves are another fascinating example. Rose, who lives a few streets over, tried for 3 years to establish foxgloves in a shaded border she'd prepared specifically for them. She bought plants from the nursery, planted them carefully, mulched around them, everything by the book. They'd flower once, maybe twice, and then gradually fade away. She was ready to give up when something unexpected happened. She dumped some old potting soil in a corner of her garden, in a spot that was partly shaded by a hedge. The next spring, foxgloves appeared there. Not just a few, but dozens of them. They self-seeded from somewhere, probably a neighbour's garden, and they chose that neglected corner as their home. Rose barely touched that spot, and for the next several years, she had the most magnificent display of foxgloves you've ever seen. What Rose learned is that foxgloves are biennial plants that really prefer to self-seed and choose their own spots. They like light, somewhat disturbed soil where there's not too much competition from other plants. When you buy foxglove plants and try to establish them in a bed full of other perennials, they're often fighting for space and resources. But when they self-seed, they come up in spots where they've got room to develop their rosette in the first year without too much competition. The parent plants seem to have an instinct for dropping seeds in favourable locations. Now let's talk about something that drives some gardeners crazy but delights others: plants that spread by creeping roots or runners. Mint is the classic example here. Everyone knows that mint is invasive, right? The standard advice is to plant mint in containers to restrict its spread. And sure, that works if you want to keep things tidy. But here's the thing: mint that's allowed to roam free in an appropriate space is incredibly vigorous and produces masses of flavorful foliage. I know a gardener named Ivy who has a shaded area behind her shed where nothing much was growing. She tossed a piece of mint root there, basically as an experiment, and walked away. Within 2 years, that entire area was a lush carpet of mint. She harvests bags of it for tea and cooking. The mint is healthier and more productive than any she'd ever grown in containers, and it's completely taken care of itself. The lesson with mint and similar spreaders like lemon balm and oregano is that they're much happier when they're not restricted. These plants have evolved to colonize areas quickly, and when we confine them to pots, we're constantly fighting against their nature. But give them a space where they can spread, somewhere that's designated as their territory, and they'll reward you with abundant growth. The key is choosing the right location, somewhere bounded by hardscape, or an area where their spreading habit is actually desirable. Nasturtiums are another personal favourite when it comes to plants that prefer a hands-off approach. My friend Lucas struggled with nasturtiums for a couple of seasons. He'd plant them in his vegetable garden, which had beautiful, rich soil. The nasturtiums would produce enormous leaves, creating huge, lush mounds of foliage. And flowers, maybe a few here and there, but nothing spectacular. Then one day, almost out of frustration, he scattered some seeds along a strip of really poor soil next to his fence. This area was basically hard pan clay with some gravel mixed in. Well, those nasturtiums went absolutely crazy with flowers. Masses and masses of brilliant orange, yellow and red blooms all summer long. The explanation is similar to the California poppies situation. Nasturtiums originated in South America, in areas where the soil isn't particularly rich. When you grow them in fertile soil, they put all their energy into producing leaves. But put them in poor soil and suddenly they shift their energy into flowers and seeds because they're getting the message that conditions might not last, so they better reproduce while they can. It's a survival strategy that works beautifully in our favour when we understand it. Wildflower mixes are perhaps the ultimate expression of this philosophy. The best results I've ever seen with wildflower meadows have come from the simplest preparation methods. You don't want to till up nice soil and plant wildflowers there. What works much better is to rough up some poor soil, maybe even strip away existing turf to expose bare ground, scatter the seeds, and then just let nature take its course. Many wildflower species are adapted to nutrient-poor soils. In rich conditions, aggressive grasses and common weeds quickly dominate and crowd out the flowers. In poorer soil, the balance shifts in favour of the flowering plants. There's also something to be said for the natural selection that happens when you let plants self-seed and choose their own locations. Over time, the plants that are best adapted to your specific conditions are the ones that survive and reproduce. This is especially true with plants like columbines. If you let columbines self-seed and do their own thing, you'll gradually develop a population that thrives in your garden. The colours might not be exactly what you initially planted, but the plants will be vigorous and well adapted. I've seen gardens where columbines have naturalized over decades, creating wonderful drifts of mixed colors that appear in different spots each year. Fennel is another herb that fits this pattern perfectly. It's actually quite difficult to transplant fennel successfully. The plant develops a long taproot, and it really doesn't like being moved once it's established. But fennel self-seeds readily, and those seedlings that come up on their own almost always do better than transplants. A gardener I know tried multiple times to establish bronze fennel in her borders. She'd buy plants, carefully position them, and they'd limp along before giving up. Finally, she bought one plant, let it flower and go to seed, and just watched what happened. The next spring, fennel seedlings popped up all over. She thinned them out a bit, leaving plants in spots that made sense, and those seedlings grew into magnificent specimens. The taproot issue is important with quite a few plants. Anything that develops a substantial taproot, like poppies or evening primrose, generally prefers to be grown from seed in place rather than transplanted. When you try to move these plants, you damage the taproot, and that sets them back significantly. But seeds sown where the plant will grow allow that taproot to develop properly from the start, giving the plant access to deeper soil moisture and creating a much more stable, resilient specimen. Some vegetables even fall into this category, particularly ones that readily self-seed. Lettuce is a great example. If you let a few lettuce plants flower and go to seed, you'll often find seedlings appearing in your garden the following season. These volunteer lettuces can be some of the best you'll grow. They come up at the right time for your climate, they're already adapted to your soil, and they often seem more vigorous. The same thing happens with arugula, cilantro, and dill. These plants want to self-seed. By harvesting everything before they can complete their life cycle, we're working against that natural tendency. But let a few plants do their thing, and you can have these useful crops appearing on their own, providing bonus harvests without any work. Alyssum is another annual flower that demonstrates this principle beautifully. When you buy alyssum transplants and set them out, they do fine. But if you let alyssum go to seed, it'll come back on its own the following year, often in abundance. I've seen alyssum self-seed into gravel paths, between paving stones, and in all sorts of spots where you'd never think to plant it. And in these self-selected locations, it's often more prolific than when it's formally planted. The flowers seem more abundant, the plants more compact and healthy. Verbena bonariensis is a tall, airy perennial with purple flowers that self-seeds prolifically. Gardeners often buy plants and position them carefully, and the plants do well. But the real magic happens in the second and third years when seedlings start appearing everywhere. Rather than being a problem, these self-seeded plants create a wonderful naturalistic effect. Smart gardeners learn to recognize verbena seedlings and just edit them, rather than fighting against them. Pull out the ones that are truly in the wrong place, but leave the ones that work. The result is a garden that looks designed, but also natural. One thing I want to emphasize is that this approach isn't about being lazy or neglectful with your garden. It's actually about being observant and working with plant nature rather than against it. You're still making decisions, still editing and guiding the process, but you're doing it in partnership with the plants. This approach requires you to recognize seedlings, to understand which volunteers are desirable and which are weeds, to see the potential in unexpected places. There's also an important environmental aspect to this approach. Plants that grow from seed in place, that don't require transplanting, that thrive without soil amendment and excessive watering, these are inherently more sustainable. You're not buying plastic pots full of transplants. You're not amending soil unnecessarily. You're not using extra water. And you're creating habitat that's more valuable for wildlife. Self-seeded, naturalistic plantings provide better resources for pollinators than overly manicured plantings. Learning to let go of complete control in your garden can actually be quite freeing. There's something wonderful about walking through your garden and discovering a plant has appeared somewhere unexpected. I've had some of my favorite garden moments come from these surprises. A patch of poppies that seeded themselves into gravel and created this stunning drift of colour. Feverfew appearing in the cracks of stone steps. Purple orach self-seeding in the vegetable garden and providing beautiful burgundy foliage that looks amazing mixed in with vegetables. The timing aspect is also worth considering. When you let plants self-seed, they come up when conditions are right according to their own internal programming. This is often different from when we would choose to plant them. A plant's seeds respond to temperature, moisture, and day length that tell them when conditions are optimal. So self-seeded plants often have better timing, emerging when they're most likely to succeed, which contributes to better growth and stronger plants. Some of the best gardeners I know have developed this skill of recognizing potential volunteers and giving them a chance. They've learned to delay spring cleanup, leaving seed heads standing through winter so seeds can disperse naturally. They've learned to weed carefully, taking a moment to identify seedlings before pulling them out. They've learned to see bare spots or challenging areas as opportunities for experimentation. What if you just scattered some seeds there and walked away? Sometimes the results are magical. Of course, this approach isn't right for every plant or every situation. You still want to transplant perennials where you've carefully chosen spots based on design considerations. But even in a relatively formal garden, there's room for some spontaneity. These self-seeded elements often end up being the most charming features, the ones that make the garden feel lived in and natural rather than stiff and contrived. The other consideration is editing. When plants self-seed successfully, you often get many more seedlings than you want or need. Part of working with self-seeding plants is being willing to thin them out, to keep just the ones in the best positions. This can feel wasteful if you're not used to it, but it's essential. View it as editing rather than wasting, making decisions about which plants to keep. I think one of the most valuable lessons in gardening is learning when to intervene and when to step back. There are times when plants need our help. But there are also times when the best thing we can do is get out of the way. These plants that grow better when we don't plant them are teaching us that lesson. They're showing us that sometimes our well-intentioned efforts are actually hindering rather than helping. They're reminding us that plants are resilient, adaptable, and often much smarter about their own needs than we give them credit for. So the next time you're planning your garden, consider leaving some spaces open for spontaneity. Scatter some seeds of plants known for self-seeding and see what happens. Let some plants go to seed rather than deadheading everything. Pay attention to the volunteers that appear and ask yourself whether they might actually be in a good spot. Look at those challenging areas in your garden and wonder whether they might be perfect for plants that prefer neglect over care. This is part of developing that partnership with your garden, that relationship where you're both teaching and learning. The garden teaches you what works in your specific conditions. You teach the garden through editing and guiding. It's a conversation that develops over years, and the result is something more interesting and resilient than anything either of you could have created alone. That's the real magic of working with plants that grow better when you don't plant them. They're asking us to reimagine our role, to see ourselves less as controllers and more as collaborators, witnesses to the incredible things plants can do when we give them room to be themselves.